I bit off way more than I could chew with this video. Turns out bet check is a really, really complicated spot to explain. I also did it on like 4 hours of sleep, so bear with me. But if you're really nerdy and you're interested in just exactly how complicated poker can be, then this might be the video for you. So take care, and I hope you enjoy.
Hey, so I polled Reddit asking for suggestions on any kind of spots that they'd like some education on, any concepts that they'd like explained. One Redditor suggested lines where a villain goes bet, and the river they check. So I'm going to explain how that spot might work, in particular when we are in position versus an out-of-position opponent who, let's say, check raises the flop, bets turn, and then checks river. So for this example, we'll use Queen 8 Deuce Rainbow. We'll imagine that we are on the button and the villain is in the big blind. Let's say that we c-bet 1/3 on Queen 8 Deuce Rainbow. Our opponent check raises half pot. They overbet turn 125%. Let's say the turn is like a 3, creating a backdoor flush draw. And the river is an offsuit 10. And they check. So Queen 8 Deuce 3 10, no flush completer. So pause the video for a second and think to yourself, what are some likely hands that your opponent should have based on your best guess as to what, semi-GTO or sensible play might look like? Okay, so obviously I'm inventing this example, but one of the hands that comes to mind is something that you might see at Showdown would be Jack 10 in a real game. In some ways the 10 might actually be a good river card for them to barrel, because I don't think a 10 has very much showdown value, really. Or maybe 9-10 as well, Jack 10 or 9-10. But let's just say that the villain gets to the river with a 10 and they just decide, well, I have some showdown value now. I don't think my opponent's folding, so I'm just going to give up and check. That is the type of hand that you're going to see most often in a bet check line. Is a hand that has some shred of showdown value, and so the villain decides to slow down. A more sensible thinking opponent will just consider ultimately how good the card is for both players' ranges and how much value they have in that spot. If they have an excess of value in that spot, then they really need to fire all of their bluffs. But if instead they have very little value because the card is equity shifting, or they're just supposed to have a lot of bluffs that break out in general, then obviously they need to do a decent amount of giving up. Regardless of exactly how the spot is supposed to work in terms of frequency of bluff, after your opponent checks, their range is supposed to be condensed around complete air, like hands that bricked out, hands that got some kind of reasonable showdown value. So they're supposed to have some hand with medium to low showdown value, complete air, and then theoretically a very small number of traps. Although one thing I'll advise is I don't think that players are probably going to trap much. And if they do trap, it's going to be more for just kind of like impulsive reasons rather than for reasons that make sense across an overall strategy. So how is your range supposed to play against that?
Okay, so we're going to look at this spot given 2 different bet sizes on the turn. Depending on how the SPR is on the river, the spot will play a little bit differently, although the same principles do kind of apply. It's just that, like, when you've got a pot size bet left on the river, anything that's going to go for value almost might as well shove. It should be pretty intuitive for a lot of people that, like, if there's $1 billion in the middle already, are you really going to open the action to bet a really, really small size when, you could just check and win? If you're going to bet, you might as well go for all of it. Whereas if there's a huge amount of money left behind, then you have a few different options, right? So, okay, we bet, we get raised, we call, turns a brickish card, right? So notice at 100 big blinds, most of the time, the out of position player is just trying to stack you. They're going to bet 130 and then they're going to shove river for like 100. So if we bet 130, we get called. River, we're going to make that 10 that we talked about. And sure enough, one of the hands that gets here that's particularly sad and doesn't really know what to do is Jack 10. Jack 10 can bluff, Jack 10 mostly checks, it's kind of whatever. And you'll see that the button is really targeting that type of hand with most of the range. Like, kings, like I just sort of talked about, right? Like, it doesn't really make sense to shove kings all that often. Like, or sorry, it doesn't really make sense to bet 1/3 with kings anyway. But if you are going to value bet it, you might as well go for all the money, right? So if you're going to bet kings, you're going to rip it. And then you do see this really, really small amount of betting tiny as well. And again, like the thing the spot wants to do is shove, but the thing that is making us want to bet 1/3 is the range, because the range is so polarized that we're just targeting, like, there's air, there's this random, like, I caught a scrap of some nonsense showdown value and I'm basically giving up, but kind of also let me show down. And then there's traps. So, like, you know, if you're going to target the range, you're either, like, making them hero call with those middling crap hands, or you're putting them in hell with, like, this really, really tiny bet. And both options make a certain amount of sense. But anyways, like, that's kind of why you see this 1/3 bet with queen, ace queen. And, you know, I do suspect that if you get into this spot, there will be some people that, like, rip Jack 10 here way more often than this, because they're just like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this to me? This is so rude of you. Fold your hand, right? And sure enough, you know, the solver is actually happy to call this off. And for some reason, it'll fold this combination, but, like, I think calling all of it pure would be perfectly fine. And I'd probably call this one too. So, yeah, hopefully that makes some sense. Let's compare it, though, to if they had bet smaller. So, for whatever reason, they bet this size. We get a call. River's the 10. Now, big blind, right, can do a few different things. You can check. You can massively bet. You know, there's, like, the game is more complicated, right? So, let's just say they check. And when they check, right, now, because of the way the SPR is, it's a little bit more complicated. Like, they'll have the thing that caught a scrap of some kind of showdown value. They'll have air. They'll have super nuts. And then they'll have hands that were strong enough to overbet the turn for sure, and wanted to get called on the turn for sure. But now that they're on the river, they're like, I don't really think that this hand is going to have 50% equity when called. Or, like, barely will, especially if I bet, like, 100%. So then you've got your, like, queen jack and that sort of position. Definitely your ace 8, right? Ace 8 is like, okay, no more money goes in the pot. And then, you know, yeah, some jack 10, right? Okay, so button, right? Now what does button do in response? Yeah, so button is here. As you can see, like, similar to the big blind, now every possibility plays. And the reason that every possibility plays is that there is still at this node, like at this weird node, like, big blind has depolarized in a certain sense. Like, when they shove, obviously they're not shoving ace 8, right? When they go bet check, now the range has, like, a few different types of things in it. There are going to be a lot of hands that'll happily fold facing a really big bet, and there'll be a lot of hands that are traps and are very happily calling facing a really big bet. And so you don't really want to commit all that often, like 188% pot bet, unless it's like a hand that beats their traps or something, because you are just going to get them to fold all their air for sure, fold most of their marginal stuff, and then the traps is what is left behind. And if you just start doing this all the time, then they're just going to start trapping more, right? So you get these really greedy bets somewhere between 100 and 33, like these types of things with, like, king queen, maybe ace queen if you want, king queen off, ace queen off, right? And these types of hands that just kind of say, you just spiked a 10, didn't you? You have, like, jack 10, you have 10-9, or maybe you have, like, ace 8 that has decided that it can't put any more money in. And so if you did go with this size, right, this is, and I know I'm kind of talking more with common sense than I am with, like, theory, but you can probably imagine here that a hand like this, like, yeah, just would say, you're a jerk and I'm going to rip it. And if you did that, these hands are all mixing, but I think in practice it's, like, okay to call them off. The question of, like, how often you want to check when you are in this node is to do with what the EV of trapping becomes based on the frequency of your check. So you can imagine that if they all in for 188, The EV of the bet is something like, oh god. If it was 2x pot, the EV of the bet would be 0.66 pot. So if you're going to bet, let's say 25% on the river, then when you do that, they guaranteed capture 25% pot. And then they capture not only the 0.66 pot EV bet, but also 0.66 pot of the 2.25 pot. So they're capturing like something like 100% of a pot size bet. So you really need to check, look, dude, I'm too tired, but I don't know. Like, you have to check most of the time. If they can reliably expect you to place that small bet for them, then it makes a ton of sense for them to have a ton of traps. And as you can see here, like, this is the number that turns out the GTO gods have decided is correct, but they can do math in their heads better than me. Okay, so that's more information about the bet check node than anyone except for that one Redditor has ever asked for, so I hope that one Redditor is happy. In summary, I have a list of the things here that you want to keep in mind. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is when the villain check raises flop, bets turn, and then checks river, typically the range is going to be composed of give-ups, traps, and depending on how polarized the spot is, a lot of give-ups that caught some shred of showdown value on the river. So in the example we looked at, the 10 is a pretty decent amount of showdown value on the river, but in game you could have like basically 0% showdown value, you like river bottom pair or something on a board without flush draws, and some villains will still convince themselves that there's hope and check. If the villain didn't set up for stacks on the river, point number 2, their range is going to contain also hands that can go for two streets of value, but not 3. So like a decent top pair or middle pair with top kicker, those types of hands as well if the formation is really wide. The point of the smaller size is that it targets the very marginal hands in your opponent's range and lowers your exposure to like value cutting yourself versus traps or excessive numbers of traps. So if the range was all 5 high and the nuts, then, the smaller size, you wouldn't place any bet, but the smaller size would lose the least amount, right? Because you would get owned the least by the traps. So you would want to place that smaller size when you think they have a lot of hands that are like a pair and just have a very hard time folding to a tiny, tiny bet, especially if you think that they're going to undertrap the range. The larger size makes more sense if the range has more of those 2 streets of value type of merged hands, those weak top pair, decent middle pair type of hands. Then you want to do something like shove for pot or 1.25x pot more of the time because there's more hands that they're going to have a difficult decision with. And on top of that, larger sizes and smaller sizes have disadvantages and advantages because it is always an attractive option to check back on the river and just win the hand and realize all of your equity. Opening up the action again just to place a very small bet is something that is seldom logical to do. This is kind of one of the exceptions where you have competing incentives. The most important thing that you want to take away is that most villains, I believe, will undertrap the river. And this actually skyrockets the value of placing a really small probe because there will be villains who give up on the river, never have any traps, and then facing this tiny bet, a little demon kind of starts to cackle in their head. And last but not least, the thing to do if your opponent is doing this to you, targeting your give-ups and hands that rivered a little showdown value with really annoying tiny bets, the solution is not to start check raise bluffing the river, because if they listen to this video, then they're just going to call. The solution is just to start trapping more. And understand that the math of trapping, there doesn't have to be that many stabs, even for a small size, before trapping starts to make a little bit of sense. So yeah, that's everything I wanted to talk about in the video. There may be questions, especially about the math that I kind of banged out half asleep. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope this was enjoyable. And yeah, take care, run good, and I don't know, Merry Christmas or something.